This is lecture 13 in Introduction to Politics. I'd like to, as we're focusing now on international relations, light landly on the whole issue of international relations and human rights. There are various ways, as I've mentioned in previous reflections, on looking at human rights, and in your readings, of course, we'll be dealing with that. One is to look at an idealist approach. There are ideals worth living for, and where states and non-government organizations realize that this is their map, their markings, and as all heed those, the hope is that, in fact, a good world will emerge, a just world will emerge, a peaceful world will emerge. This is the liberal idealist perspective that often has shaped important elements of the liberal left. Out of this have come organizations like the League of Nations, and obviously since World War II, the United Nations itself. The other, on the right, political right, is what is often called the language of realism. And so within this philosophical tradition, the argument is that humanity and states, which states are just the magnifying of individuals, it is about power, and it is about survival, and it is about he or she who has the greatest amount of power is the he or she who will survive in the clash where Matthew Arnold calls in Dover Beach, where ignorant armies clash by night. And so the realist position is one that cautions idealists not to be naive about the dark, the aggressive sides of human nature itself. Now, the language within international relations of human rights is an attempt, obviously drawing from the idealist tradition, to say that there in fact are standards that all humans, all states are expected to abide by, that transcend color, they transcend skin, they transcend language, they transcend history, they transcend geography, they transcend all those things which seem to divide humans into different castes and clans and tribes, in which each and all attempt to defend their own understanding of the good life. But in the process, the other is seen as the enemy, the opposition, that which prevents someone from achieving fulfillment or happiness. The language of human rights emerges from within the Western tradition, but the ideals of human rights go much earlier than, in fact, both Western and Eastern thought. Their attempt to say that humanness or humanity has a common nature, and there are certain needs that all humans share, regardless of their history, their geography, their language, their philosophies, their religions. And it is this essential humanity that humans share that human rights attempt to articulate. So the two extremes that human rights tries to find a middle way between, sort of the skill and Charybdis of these, are on the one hand sheer relativism. There is nothing right or wrong in terms of how cultures understand themselves. There are just different cultures with different histories and languages, and no one has the right to say which is necessarily good, better, or best. They're just historic understandings of the good life. So the relativist position is one approach. We often find this historically in various forms of the discipline of anthropology, but also it can be found in other ethical positions. The other is to unhealthily absolutize a particular ethnic language, statist position, color of skin, into some form of absolutizing in which others are seen as the problem that interferes with a particular ethnic group's understanding of the good life. So between the absolutist position, which you get various racist theories, or historic peoples who see their own culture being watered down and thinned out through immigration, through refugees. They attempt to retrieve what they see was a stable period of history in which their culture, their country, had a center. This absolutizing one's own history is the flip side to the relativizing position. Now, human rights attempts to come as a via media, a middle way. It's universal human rights, but it's very wary of the universality of certain forms of ethnic nationalism and where that can lead. And we've seen that played out in many ways, whether Japanese nationalism, Chinese nationalism, German nationalism, Italian nationalism, various religious forms of nationalism. You can get that in American nationalism as well. It takes a different form, more subtle, but nonetheless, there's the tendency to absolutize a particular tradition, and those who dare to differ with it are seen as anti-patriotic. And so the freezing of one's own history or one's own political approach to reality can be problematic as well. So universal human rights comes initially as an ideal in terms of international relations. It's thought through philosophically. It has been really since the 17th, 18th century with Lockean natural rights. And then human rights emerge from that. Much philosophy is reflected on terms of which rights are significant, who defines what rights, and who's responsible for the guaranteeing and ensuring of certain rights. But after World War II, one of the key documents put in place at the time did not have the power of international law, and yet it remained and remains to this day a moral standard, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, December 10th. It put in place an understanding of rights that any country or state that belonged to the United Nations was expected, if they belonged to the United Nations, to at least in principle, if not in practice, uphold. Now, the dilemma of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was such that it tended to prioritize, given the Declaration of Human Rights, Western tendencies and leanings, it tended to emphasize more political, civil, and legal rights. It's not that it ignored cultural, social, economic rights. It just tended in the balancing of those to lean more in the Western tradition. So out of that, much debate occurred at the United Nations, particularly states from a more leftist tradition, more communal tradition when it came to social, economic, cultural rights, argued that there needed to be documents put in place for the international community and international relations that would in fact reflect these 6 key elements of rights. And the right wing, traditionally, as I mentioned, tended to hold political, civil, legal rights. If one comes from more a leftist tradition, say the American Revolution emerged from a right-wing tradition that tried to hold high political, civil, legal rights. The French Revolution, which followed shortly after the American Revolution, was much more committed to the whole area of economic, social, cultural rights, imperfectly, of course. And the danger if one is on the right, and then, of course, social, economic, cultural rights, that's not the role of the state in any way, that's the role of society. One comes more from a leftist rights tradition, it's the role of the state to protect economic, social, and cultural rights. So there is this tension in human rights. But out of this debate came 2 important covenants. One was the covenant on political, civil, legal rights, and the covenant on social, economic, and cultural rights. Both, if they're signed and ratified at the UN, and there's an optional protocol that goes with that, they do include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so they give in international relations, particularly the language of rights, standards by which states, if they have signed the declarations, the optional protocol, and the declaration is included in that, standards by which the United Nations, and non-government groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or any rights organizations can evaluate states and say, the state has signed to this, and this is the reality that's going on in these particular states. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, the whole human rights tradition within international relations itself comes out of an idealist tradition. And so there's often this clash again and again between the philosophy of rights, the ideals of rights, the legal documents of rights, and then the reality of how states operate and often how they, in their actions, deny rights. Obviously, we're living these days with the tragedy of, for example, Syria. It's 10 years this year since the Arab Spring, 211, 221, and the carnage which has taken place there. How does one, in any minimal way, where you have various states lining up to support different factions in Syria, bring some sort of minimal rights protection there for children, families, men, women, given the diverse interests in Syria itself, and of course Syria being so much a part of the cauldron of the Middle East itself, trying to find its way with very different agendas for Syria itself. We can look at what's been going on recently in Myanmar and the Muslims there. Again, you have this idealized view sometimes of Buddhism in Myanmar and Thailand. On the other hand, you get some of the horrendous rights violations going on in these countries. So we sometimes think of Buddhism, Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, and many others as a peaceful form of religion, and yet this form of Buddhism, when it becomes political, and there are many other forms of Buddhism, just not in Thailand and Myanmar, in which they play themselves out in areas in which the peaceful element is often subservient to a political element, and so it's peace for some, but not for those who challenge the state in that particular way. And obviously there's many other issues we could look at in terms of Saudi Arabia, Israel and the Palestinians, or Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The United States, which often holds high the significance of rights, the CIA since World War II has been involved in destabilizing all sorts of states in the name of their understanding of liberty and democracy itself. Russia, China, even though often they'll hold up certain understanding of rights, are often very quick, whether it's Russia and Crimea, Russia treatment of the Muslims, China's treatment of human rights activists, Tibetan Buddhism, many others. So what we have essentially when we think of international relations and human rights, there are ideals, and then there are state interests. State interests often then tumble into and are defined by realism. International vision, of which international relations is about, is an attempt to unify the world in which justice and peace are held high, but that always collides again and again with statist, realist power politics, balancing of power interests. So in the study of international relations and introduction to politics and human rights, there's this constant to and fro, this teeter-totter again and again, this pulling in different directions between what should be or what could be and the unity of humanity. On the other hand, the fragmentary statist Westphalian tradition in which politics is about states understanding their interests, the interests of their citizens, and alliances made with other states and regional organizations. But when those states do not fulfill their interests, then often they're willing to break those alliances and act unilaterally, particularly if they're big states like Russia, China, United States, and many others, Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, Israel, and the Palestinians. And so international relations is about, in theory, states coming together for a better world, given the fact we all know wars create horrendous carnage in the world. And yet, on the other hand, when interests collide, power politics dominates, and rights are often the first victim of such collisions.